My name is Alessia Brown. I'm 32. I was standing in Enzo's parents' dining room with my coat still on, holding a bottle of wine I'd brought out of habit, when his mother laughed and said, in Italian, "That $50,000 bought a lot more when the person giving it didn't ask questions." The table went quiet for a second, then his sister added something about how Americans with money always confuse generosity with intelligence. Someone else mentioned paperwork, marriage, and how easy it would be once things were official. Enzo didn't correct them. He just kept cutting his food, nodding along. They hadn't noticed anything change about me yet. I was still smiling, still setting the bottle down, still letting his mother kiss my cheek and call me by the nickname she'd always used. I pulled out my chair and sat. They kept talking, switching easily between English and Italian, careful only when it suited them. When the conversation moved back to English, Enzo reached for my hand and asked if work was still stressful, his voice warm, practiced. Under the table, his foot pressed lightly against my ankle, a reminder to stay. I stayed. His father poured wine and said something else in Italian, this time about patience, about playing things the right way until everything that mattered was legally shared. His mother laughed again, softer this time, like she was proud. I took a sip of water and set the glass down carefully so it wouldn't shake. Halfway through the meal, Enzo's sister leaned back and asked, in Italian, whether I'd wired the money yet or if they needed to remind me again. His mother replied that I always did the right thing eventually. I nodded at something Enzo said in English and smiled when his cousin asked about my week. When dessert came out, I excused myself to the bathroom. I locked the door, stood at the sink, and checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. Everything looked normal. Before I went back out, I opened my notes app and typed one sentence with my thumb. I didn't realize yet what that would trigger. I went back to the table, sat down, and let them keep talking. After dinner, Enzo followed me into the hallway while his mother wrapped leftovers. He slipped his arm around my waist and asked if I'd noticed how tense everyone had been lately. He said they were worried about his mom's health. He said they didn't like uncertainty. I said I understood. In the car, he kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on my knee, squeezing lightly whenever the silence stretched. He reminded me that Sunday dinners mattered to his family. That showing up was how they measured commitment. When I mentioned the board call I'd had to leave early for the week before, his jaw tightened. He said business could wait, family couldn't. At the next dinner, his mother asked, sweetly, whether I'd heard back from the specialist yet. I told her I was still following up. She nodded, satisfied, and asked if wiring the funds again would be easier this time or if I preferred to drop off a check. I said I'd handle it. They spoke more Italian that night, not fully switching over, just enough to test the space. When I leaned forward to help clear plates, his sister asked if I ever felt lonely running a company without anyone to take care of me. Enzo laughed and said that was what he was there for. I didn't correct him. My phone buzzed during dessert. I glanced down, then turned it face up on the table without answering. Enzo noticed. He asked in English if everything was okay. His mother said in Italian that I was always distracted when money was involved. I took a breath and asked if anyone wanted more coffee. The pressure didn't come all at once. It came in reminders, in expectations, in the way my schedule was discussed like it was a shared resource. When I said I might miss a Sunday because of a negotiation, his mother said families fall apart when people stop prioritizing the right things. Enzo told me not to make everything transactional. So I adjusted. I brought my laptop. I arrived later. I stayed longer. I learned how to look attentive while reading emails. And when they spoke around me, about me, I listened without reacting. I nodded, I smiled, I kept showing up. A few days later, sitting alone in an airport lounge with my headphones on, I opened a language app and changed the settings so the notifications wouldn't show. I didn't tell anyone. It didn't change anything right away. I still wired the money. I still showed up on Sundays. I still answered questions about timelines and paperwork like they were casual conversation. When Enzo asked if I'd booked my next work trip yet, I told him not yet. He said that was good. He liked knowing where I was. On a flight a few days later, I sat by the window and practiced quietly, mouthing words without sound. When the flight attendant asked if I wanted anything to drink, I answered in English and closed the app before she walked away. That same night, back home, I logged into the company portal I rarely touched anymore. Not the general dashboard, the archived folders. I searched by Enzo's name, then by the expense card tied to his department. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just scrolled. The numbers were small individually. A dinner here, a charge there, things that blended into the noise if you didn't slow down. I saved a few files to a private folder and shut the laptop. The next Sunday, his sister mentioned that a friend of hers needed help moving inventory before the holidays. She said it lightly, like a favor between family. Enzo squeezed my hand under the table and said we could talk about it later. I smiled and said we'd see. That night, after Enzo fell asleep, I opened my phone and changed the language app's reminders to vibrate only. Then I opened my calendar and blocked out an hour every Tuesday morning, labeling it something generic. I didn't realize then how many things would start fitting into that space. Looking back, the pattern was already there by the time I noticed it. At the beginning, it looked like generosity moving both ways. Enzo's family was loud, affectionate, constantly together. They hugged with both arms. They asked questions about my work, then laughed and said it sounded complicated. His mother cooked like feeding people was how she showed love. They made room at the table without asking. I started bringing things because it felt right. A good bottle of wine. Scarves I picked up on work trips. When his sister mentioned how much interest she was paying on her student loans, I asked for the balance and took care of it quietly. No announcement, just done. After that, the needs came closer together. The refrigerator broke. I ordered a new one. The dishwasher flooded the kitchen. I paid the repair. A cousin was between jobs and needed something flexible. I created a role that didn't exist yet and told HR to move fast. Enzo thanked me that night and said his family would never forget it. They didn't forget, they remembered who to ask. One afternoon, Enzo showed up at my office with his resume printed out, already folded. He said his current job was going nowhere and asked what it would look like if he came on board with me. The resume was thin. He said he'd learn. I said we could try something limited and see how it went. It didn't stay limited. His responsibilities expanded without the skill catching up. When things went wrong, he'd say it was because he didn't have enough authority yet. His brother needed work too, apparently, something important, so he'd feel respected. I approved the title because it seemed easier than explaining why not. The first time I asked Enzo for support and didn't get it was during a stretch when my company was under pressure and my days ran long. I told him I might need to skip a Sunday dinner to prepare for a call with investors in another time zone. He said his mother would be hurt. He said it would look bad. He asked why I couldn't plan better. I went to dinner. I brought my laptop and answered emails between courses. When his mother asked if I was even present, Enzo laughed and said I didn't know how to relax. No one defended me. They just kept eating. After that, it became normal for my time to be negotiated by other people. Money followed the same path. Small things first, then larger ones framed as temporary. When his mother said there was a medical issue and the insurance wouldn't cover everything, the number was large but the story was urgent. I wrote the check the same day. She cried. She kissed my hands. No paperwork ever appeared. I didn't question it. I told myself this was what commitment looked like, showing up, carrying weight when other people couldn't. By the time I started blocking out Tuesday mornings on my calendar, I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I was just paying attention to how often the help moved in one direction and how easily it was assumed. Once I started paying attention, the requests lined up more clearly. My workdays stretched longer as negotiations intensified. I was sleeping in short gaps, eating whatever was closest, moving between meetings without leaving the building. On Sundays, I drove straight from the office to his parents' house, changed shoes in the car, and tried to arrive looking like I hadn't been there since dawn. They noticed when I was tired. They just interpreted it as availability. When I said I might need to leave early for an emergency board call, Enzo's mother set her fork down and asked if I understood what commitment meant. Enzo said we'd talk about it later, his voice already firm. In the car, He told me it embarrassed him when I prioritized work in front of his family. So I stayed. I joined calls from the hallway. I muted myself when dessert was served. They spoke Italian more often then. Longer stretches. Less effort to translate. I listened while clearing plates, while refilling glasses, while Enzo leaned back in his chair and let them talk around him. When his sister asked, in Italian, whether I'd signed off on the new credit limit yet, Enzo answered for me. Yes, he said, she trusts me. The company card stopped feeling symbolic and started functioning like a shared wallet. Charges appeared that had nothing to do with business. When I asked, Enzo said it was temporary. He said it was easier than reimbursing everything. He said he'd fix it later. Around that time, his brother's title changed again. The responsibilities didn't. Meetings were missed. Deadlines slipped. When I brought it up, Enzo said family needed patience. He said I couldn't expect loyalty without giving it first. The handbag idea came up over dinner one night, framed as a side project. A friend of the family had connections. They just needed seed money and a place to work. Enzo said it would keep everyone busy. His mother said it would be nice for me to support something creative for once. I agreed to cover the startup costs. It was easier than arguing across a table full of people watching. The language lessons became routine. Tuesday mornings, 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there. I stopped translating word by word and started catching tone. Jokes, assumptions. The night I closed the biggest deal of my career, I didn't go home. I drove straight to Sunday dinner with a folder still open on the passenger seat. I was lightheaded from relief. I'd already booked flights in my head, already pictured telling them. When I walked in, they were mid-conversation, speaking freely. I understood enough to know they weren't talking about me the way I thought they were. I hung my coat up, stepped into the kitchen, and waited for the right moment to sit down. They didn't lower their voices when I walked in. Enzo's mother was at the head of the table, talking about timing. His sister was leaning against the counter, scrolling on her phone. Someone mentioned the surgery again, casually this time, like it was old news. Another voice said 50,000 was nothing compared to what was coming once everything was settled. I sat down and unfolded my napkin. Enzo reached for my hand and asked if the meeting went well. I said yes. He smiled and told his mother I'd had a good week. She nodded and said in Italian that good weeks made people generous. They laughed. I listened, not every word, enough. His father asked Enzo if he was still being careful. Enzo said he was. He said it was just a matter of time. Marriage came up. Paperwork. How things would change once names were combined. His sister said she couldn't believe how easy it was to build a future when someone else was paying for it. They switched back to English to ask if I wanted more wine. I said no, thank you. The room felt smaller than it had before. Not tense. Confident. Like they believed the outcome was already decided. Enzo leaned back in his chair and talked about the holidays. He said we should do something special this year. A real trip. Somewhere meaningful. I nodded and said I'd been thinking the same thing. That night, after we got home, Enzo fell asleep quickly. I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone and scrolled until I found the name I'd heard too many times in passing. Julia, always mentioned like an afterthought. A business contact. Someone who helped with logistics. Her profile wasn't private. The photos went back years. Trips, dinners, comments that read like inside jokes. I didn't need to scroll far to see the pattern. Shared events, overlapping dates, the same watch on Enzo's wrist. I set the phone down and opened my laptop instead. I made a list, not emotional, just factual. Names, dates, amounts, access points. By the time I turned the light off, I knew I wasn't going to say anything yet. I also knew I wasn't canceling Sunday dinner. I didn't change my routine. That part mattered. I still arrived with something in my hands on Sundays. I still let Enzo talk over me when he felt like it. When his mother asked questions that were really instructions, I answered them calmly and wrote things down like I always had. The work happened elsewhere. The first call I made was to our outside counsel, under the pretense of reviewing access controls after the recent deal. I asked for a quiet audit, no notifications, no flags that would ripple through the system, just eyes on paper. A forensic accountant joined the review a week later. I didn't introduce them to anyone. I forwarded files at night and labeled them incorrectly on purpose so nothing looked out of place. The private folder grew. Charges stacked up faster once I stopped reacting. Enzo grew comfortable. He stopped explaining expenses at all. When I asked if he'd submitted receipts, he said it didn't matter. He said we were a team. I nodded and asked him if he'd booked his holiday time yet. At dinner the following week, I mentioned Italy. Casually, I said I'd always wanted to go during the winter. His mother's fork paused midair. His sister asked where. Enzo looked at me like he was surprised, then pleased. I said Tuscany, a villa, enough space for everyone. They talked over each other for the rest of the meal. I let the idea expand without correcting anything. I watched what excited them and what they asked about first. Storage, proximity to cities, how strict customs were that time of year, whether bringing extra luggage would be a problem. I said I'd cover it. Behind the scenes, access shifted. Enzo's company credentials were duplicated to a monitoring account. Spending limits were adjusted but not cut. I wanted the trail complete. When a wire transfer went through for inventory I hadn't approved, I saved the confirmation and moved on. The investigator's report came in 2 weeks later. It was clean and unemotional. Timelines, shared accounts, plans discussed over messages that assumed privacy, a wedding sketched out after a divorce that hadn't happened yet. I read it once and closed the file. At the next dinner, his sister said they might need to bring product with them to Italy, just temporarily, to show buyers. She laughed and said it would be good exposure. I told her to bring as much as she wanted. I said I'd pay the excess baggage fees. Enzo squeezed my hand hard enough to hurt. I didn't pull away. Thanksgiving came early that year, crowded and loud in the way his family preferred. I waited until everyone had a plate before I said anything. I didn't stand up. I didn't tap a glass. I just mentioned, between bites, that I'd confirmed the villa and the flights. I said Christmas would be in Italy. For a second, no one spoke. Then the table erupted. His mother reached across and grabbed my hand with both of hers. His sister started asking questions all at once. How many rooms, how close to Florence, whether we'd need adapters. Enzo looked stunned, then pleased, then proud, like this was something he'd earned. They switched to Italian without hesitation. I listened while they planned. Who would bring what? How much inventory made sense? Which contacts might want to meet them there? His father said something about timing the markets. His sister joked about how easy it would be once they were closer to the source. I ate and nodded when spoken to in English. I answered questions. I let assumptions stand. After dinner, Enzo pulled me aside in the hallway. He said this was big. He said his family would never forget what I'd done. He kissed my forehead and told me he loved me. I said I loved him too. The weeks after that moved quickly. Luggage appeared in their living room when I stopped by. Boxes stacked in corners. His sister sent me links to storage cases and asked if hard shells were better for international travel. I told her to get whatever she liked. At the airport, they were giddy, talking loudly, making jokes. They stopped lowering their voices when I walked up. Enzo's mother said in Italian that this was the beginning of everything finally working out. I smiled and handed over the passports. On the plane, Enzo slept with his head against the window. His sister leaned across the aisle and asked, in Italian, whether customs would be a problem. His father said not to worry. He said people like me handled things. I watched the flight map crawl east and kept my hands folded in my lap. When we landed, they moved through the terminal like they owned the place, bags heavy with things they didn't bother hiding. Jokes exchanged freely now, not bothering to translate. No one noticed when I stepped slightly to the side and let them go first. Customs took longer than they expected. They shifted their weight in line, annoyed more than nervous. Bags were opened, then closed again. Questions were asked. Answers were given too quickly. I stood a few steps back, hands free, watching faces instead of luggage. Eventually, they were waved through. His sister laughed and said, in Italian, that people worried too much about rules when they didn't know who to talk to. His father said this was why it was good to travel with someone connected. No one asked what I'd said at the counter. The drive to the villa took just under 2 hours. The road narrowed, the landscape softened, and conversation turned to plans. Who would take which room? How many people could stay comfortably? Whether the dining table would be big enough. When the gates opened, the car went quiet. The house was larger than they'd pictured. Stone, low and wide, set back from the road. The view stretched further than anyone spoke about. Enzo squeezed my hand and said I'd outdone myself. His mother crossed herself and said this was what blessings looked like. I gave the caretaker my name and accepted the keys. He nodded and left without much ceremony. They moved in fast, bags dragged across floors, doors claimed, boxes unpacked. By the first evening, the living room had turned into something else entirely. Tables were cleared, dust covers pulled off, items laid out carefully, one by one. They didn't bother hiding it. More people arrived over the next 2 days. Cousins, friends of friends, names I didn't try to remember. They came with empty suitcases and left with them heavier. Conversations overlapped in Italian, confident and unguarded. Prices discussed, buyers mentioned. How much further things could go now that they were closer? I sat with a glass of water and listened. The cameras were already running. Small, unobtrusive, installed weeks earlier when the purchase finalized. No one looked up. On Christmas Eve, the dining room filled beyond what we'd planned. Plates passed. Wine poured. Someone joked about how easy it was when the money never ran out. Another voice said they'd underestimated how long I'd stay quiet. Enzo caught my eye from across the table and smiled like everything was exactly as it should be. I lifted my glass, met his gaze, and took a sip. I waited until the room quieted for a moment, then spoke in Italian. Every head turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes widened. They had assumed I didn't understand, that I was still the Bella who nodded and smiled. I started with small details. The fake surgery, the $50,000, the casual laughter at my expense, the embezzled corporate funds. I let the recordings play softly on my phone so the voices they'd assumed private filled the room again. Enzo's hand froze halfway to a glass of wine. His mother's fork dropped. His sister's phone slipped from her fingers. Julia, in the corner, tried to cover a stack of documents, but I had already noted them for authorities. I explained calmly that the villa was mine, fully purchased, and that their stay had an official end date. Bank accounts had been frozen. Corporate access revoked. Legal filings were underway. Italian customs had been notified about the merchandise. Panic rose gradually, unevenly. They whispered to one another, pointed, argued. Accusations flared between them. Names were blamed. Excuses faltered. Enzo said something in English, pleading, but I didn't answer. The eviction notice sat on the sideboard. My phone buzzed once with confirmation. Officers on their way. I poured a glass of water, set it down, and continued listening as the family turned on itself. By the time police arrived the next morning, several members were taken in for questioning. Enzo's passport had been flagged. He couldn't leave the country. More fraudulent transfers surfaced in follow-up investigations. Offers of immunity were quietly declined or deferred. I stood in the empty villa, the quiet hum of the heating system filling the space. Outside, sunlight touched the rolling hills. Inside, all that remained was paperwork, cameras, and the absence of people who had assumed control over me and my resources. I didn't celebrate. I walked through the rooms, checked the locks, and made sure the villa was secure. It was mine now, not just in law, but in every detail. The chapter was closed. The days after Christmas moved slowly. Police officers came and went, taking statements, reviewing records, checking the villa. Enzo and several family members were questioned, and their movements traced. Julia's involvement became clear, her claims of independence unraveling under scrutiny. At the company, the board convened. They reviewed all transactions flagged by my team and the forensic accountant. The misappropriated funds were recovered where possible. Further embezzlement came to light. Offers of cooperation from his sister were considered, but nothing changed the fact that the plan had been fully documented. I sat in my temporary office in Florence, looking at spreadsheets, reports, and recordings. Everything fit together. The puzzle completed itself, quietly, without confrontation or yelling. Emails were filed. Legal actions were queued, authorities notified. Enzo's passport remained flagged. Bank access was suspended. The villa, once bustling with chaos, was empty except for me and the caretaker, who still moved silently from room to room. I unpacked a few personal items, arranged them in the rooms I intended to use, and checked the locks one more time. Outside, the hills were soft and rolling under the winter sun. Inside, there was only order. I didn't feel relief in the way I expected, just clarity, an understanding that generosity cannot be confused with weakness and that boundaries, once enforced, hold. Family isn't something you buy, it's something that chooses you back. By the time I boarded a train to Rome to catch my flight home, the villa behind me was quiet. Investigations continued, but the immediate danger was gone. I left Italy with the sense that I had closed the chapter, not in anger, not in triumph, but in control. I would return when I wanted, not because someone expected it, not because anyone assumed I owed it. It was finally mine. Back home, the first morning felt different. No messages from Enzo, no updates about shipments or urgent family requests. The inbox was quiet. My phone stayed on the nightstand. The city moved around me, and I moved through it differently, slower, measured. I returned to the office a few days later. My team was still processing the aftermath at the company, but the pressure had shifted. Decisions were mine alone again. Meetings were real, deadlines mattered, and the calendar wasn't a negotiation with anyone else's expectations. I scheduled a morning walk before work and paused at a cafe window, listening to voices around me. Conversations weren't tests. Questions weren't manipulations. The villa in Tuscany remained under my name. The authorities finalized reports, and the frozen account stayed that way. Enzo's family had no access, no leverage, no path forward beyond the legal consequences unfolding in real time. I reviewed the cameras once more, made note of everything filed, then turned them off. I didn't need the reminders anymore. Weeks later, the board confirmed that all fraudulent charges had been accounted for. Giulia's partnership with Enzo was voided in practice, not just on paper. The company, my company, was intact. More importantly, I could operate without fear of being undermined by someone pretending to care. I booked a quiet trip back to Italy months later on my own terms. The villa was empty, waiting, secure. The hills stretched in the same gentle light. No one was there to claim anything but the space itself. I walked through the rooms, opened the windows, and let the sun in. Generosity had been tested. Boundaries had been crossed. But clarity, once established, remained. I had found control, not revenge, and in it, a kind of calm I hadn't known in years. I left knowing that some lessons are expensive, some people can't be trusted, and some victories are quiet. I kept the villa. I kept the company. I kept my peace. And for the first time in a long time, the doors were open only on my terms.